Okay, lovely. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of webinars, which is on the Riesling grape variety. So I hope some of you have been able to join some of the ones so far. We've been looking at a few different grape varieties over the last few weeks. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon have all had a go, but today it is the turn for Riesling. Just to introduce myself briefly before I get started, my name is Julia Lambeth. I'm one of the educators at WSET School London. Normally in the classroom in front of bunches of people talking about wine, but obviously that's all off the books right now, so happy to be here in front of you virtually and to talk to you about Riesling. So I will confess just before I start, this kind of ended up becoming a bit of a manifesto for Riesling as I was planning it, just thinking, oh, put a few facts about Riesling together, a bit of history, a bit of that, and it's basically going to be me saying Riesling is the best, everyone should drink Riesling. So you have been warned. So we've got a few different aspects of Riesling to cover. I want to think about the characteristics of the grape, think about where it's grown, styles of wine around the world. Obviously, I can't cover everywhere in the world. I'm only planning to go for about an hour. So forgive me if I miss out your favourite region, but I've included my favourites. So I think that's fair. So here we're going to start with a bit of an introduction to Riesling as a grape variety. So we've got a few terms there which I often think about when we talk about Riesling. Undervalued, absolutely. So given that it's one of the white grape varieties that is capable of producing some of the most complex, most age-worthy wines in the world, it often gets a little bit overlooked. Mispronounced, certainly. I think we all probably started calling it Riesling until we were corrected and told it was in fact Riesling. But it doesn't really help the taste of the grape variety if many of us trying to enjoy it can't actually say it properly. Misunderstood I put there as well. And like I said, it's a bit of a sad tale for Riesling. It gets better as we go along. Misunderstood, I think, largely because there is an association with sweet wines for Riesling. It absolutely can produce sweet wines. It makes some delicious sweet wines. I know some of you are drinking some of those tonight, but it also makes dry wines. It makes medium wines. It makes wines in all levels of sweetness. So for people to say they don't really like Riesling because they don't like sweet wines is a bit of a simplification, and it proves that you don't necessarily, not everyone understands the full range of what Riesling can do. There's also a bit of a kind of misconception around Riesling due to the fact that a few other grape varieties were created that sound like Riesling but are not as good. So things like Welsh Riesling, Alsace Riesling, there's a few different grape varieties that have the word Riesling in the name but are not actually Riesling, and they don't produce wines that are as good. And so you can understand how that can get confusing. I think the other reason it became misunderstood was due to a lot of, I'm also going to say, lower quality German wines being produced a few decades ago. Riesling is of course a German variety. I'll talk a little bit more about the history shortly. But there's been an assumption that a lot of the wines that come out from Germany must be Riesling. And of course that's not true. So when a few of the bigger brand but lower quality German wines came out a few decades ago, they were incredibly successful commercially, but they didn't, again, do anything for the reputation of Riesling. People assumed it was Riesling when it was not. So Riesling's had a bit of an uphill PR battle for the last couple of decades. But of course it hasn't always been like this. We will look back at the history of Germany in particular, where Riesling was one of the most highly, for some people of course, still is the most highly regarded white wines in the world. So a little bit more in terms of the introduction. So Riesling is an aromatic grape variety, so it makes wines that are aromatic, wines that have more than just fruit flavours, so floral characteristics, sometimes spicy, sometimes mineral notes. It's got a wide range of different aroma and flavour characteristics that we can expect. Also expressive. So Riesling, like many of the other grape varieties that we've looked at so far in this series, will change its aroma and flavour characteristics, its structure and texture, depending on where it's been grown, depending on the soil, the climate, depending on the winemaking techniques. So we can get lots of variation in style from different Riesling wines. The varying levels of sweetness I've already mentioned, be it a good thing or a bad thing in your book. I would say a good thing, because it just means that we get even more different styles of wine. It does mean that it can be sometimes tricky to know what to expect when you're opening a bottle. And I think many people as consumers would like to know before they taste the wine whether it's going to have some sugar in it or not. So that's been one of the challenges for Riesling, and still is a challenge for Riesling. And then one of the best things about Riesling is its potential for aging, capable of aging for decades. I think many people would argue that Riesling has the best potential for aging out of any white grape variety in the world. I think I've noticed a few people sharing what they were tasting. I think the oldest vintage I saw was 2009, so, and that's pretty good. If you've got anything older than that, feel free to share. But in the lifespan of most Rieslings, that's still pretty young. So that the wines that are already 10 years old could still potentially age for longer. And I think that's quite cool. I quite like the idea of keeping wines. I mean, obviously you've got to buy at least a few of each, age it, try it after a few years, leave the rest, try the next one a few years later, and just experience that development. Think about how the wine changes, how it evolves in the bottle. The only thing that is difficult about that, of course, is having the willpower not to open them too soon. So next, I wanted to mention some of the characteristics of Riesling as a grape variety. So if you've done any of the WSET qualifications before, you'll know that when we think about particular grape varieties, there are a number of different characteristics that we can ascribe to each particular variety, and then we can often think about how it changes, the wines change, the growing conditions change in different areas around the world. So a few key things about Riesling which are going to be true anywhere. First off, it's suited to cool climates. So when we think about where Riesling grows, Germany obviously being the #1 country, but we'll have a look at a few others as well. These are regions that are definitely cool. But it's a great variety that can handle cool. As you can see there from the couple of following points, it is a cold hardy vine. It doesn't suffer too much in cool conditions, and it's also frost resistant. So one of the big challenges we know from growing grapes in cool climates is that frost risk, particularly in spring, can have quite a big damaging effect. So if we're looking at a grape variety that is frost resistant, it means that it's going to be all the better suited to the cool climates where we like to grow it. Alongside that, we've got a grape variety that is late budding. So when we talk about the timing of budding, it means when in the springtime that the buds on the vine open up, that the new leaves, shoots, and everything comes out. So again, thinking back to that frost risk, frost can occur often earlier in springtime, not always, but often. So if we have a variety that buds a bit later, it does put it past the risk of maximum frost exposure. So again, that's just going to help with the growing conditions. Slow ripening was the next point that I put there. And this is one of the things that really makes Riesling wines quite interesting to taste. Because it's slow ripening, it means essentially that it just has this capability of building up flavour slowly over an extended growing season. So one of the reasons that we often associate Riesling with quite a lot of intensity, quite a lot of complexity of flavour, is that it just takes its time building up these flavours. And this is one of the reasons why Riesling is suited to quite particular areas. Cool climate, yes, of course, but ideally we want to have the best sites within a cool climate. If we think about site selection, you want south-facing slopes that are going to be more exposed to the sunshine, more heat and sunlight. And we also ideally want somewhere that's going to be a little bit protected from any incoming bad weather. So if we can leave the grapes on the vine for longer, particularly through the autumn, it just means that Riesling can take its time and build up this flavour over that extended period. We'll see later that labelling terms have been created to show different styles of Riesling, or how the wine can create different styles when it is harvested later. So in Germany, we'll mention Spätlese. In France, we can talk about Vendange tardive. These are additional labelling terms that have been created to reflect grapes that have been harvested later, where we do tend to get this slightly different character in terms of aromas and flavours. One of the things that I didn't put here is the Riesling also has a naturally high acidity, which it maintains through these phases of ripening. So when you are thinking about Riesling, whether it's a dry Riesling or a sweet Riesling or something in the middle, nearly always we're going to have that refreshing characteristic, that acidity, that either helps balance sweetness or just helps give you this lovely characteristic to the dry wines. So acidity is very important for all types of Riesling. And then a couple of points at the bottom there, that Riesling is prone to botrytis and coulure. So botrytis, here we're talking about noble rot. So one of the ways we can make sweet wines from Riesling is by using noble rot affected grapes. And that is, again, practiced widely in many places around the world to make some delicious wines, let's be fair. So botrytis, normally we're thinking a good thing. Coulure, not so much. Coulure means that during the flowering phase in spring, you can get uneven flowering, uneven fruit set. So it can cause problems within the bunches of grapes. You don't get as many flowers setting as you should do. So that's a little bit more of a challenge. But I mean, on the whole, if we think about all of these characteristics put together, Riesling pretty sturdy as far as grape varieties grow. Certainly not quite the challenge that we had when we talked about Pinot Noir a few weeks ago. So from the grape characteristics, I just wanted to have a little mention of the history. So the first documented account of Riesling is dated 1628. This was actually Riesling in Alsace rather than Riesling in Germany, so we know it existed before that. It's estimated that it's been around since approximately the 1400s, somewhere around there. So it is quite old. Its parentage is not so clear. When we think of some of the other grape varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, it's more widely understood where it came from. But with Riesling, it's sort of considered to have evolved through a number of grape varieties in Germany, often being cross-fertilized with just wild native vines. So a couple of grape varieties have been indicated in the parentage along the way. So Traminer and Gouet Blanc, two not particularly famous grape varieties, and certainly Riesling wasn't just the product of these two. As I said, it was a sort of evolution over many years. In terms of where the name Riesling itself came from, there's a couple of theories for that as well. So one of them is that it's related to the word Russe, which is indicative of the dark wood that you can see in the picture there. The trunk of Riesling has this naturally darker colour to the wood. Or that it's related to the word Dirk Riesling, which is the German term for Couleur. So we mentioned just now that Riesling is susceptible to this, so it could make sense that the grape variety kind of took its name from this concept. But we don't really know, and there's a number of different kind of spellings in different records, so it's again unclear as to who started it first or what it was first called. But these days it is agreed on around the world that it's called Riesling. So it is a German variety, I've mentioned that already, so it's grown pretty much everywhere in Germany, so all regions grow some amount of Riesling, some more, some less. But it's not only in Germany that we'll find it. So we'll have a little bit more of a detailed look in a minute, but it grew from Germany obviously to France, Alsace we'll touch upon, other parts of Europe, and then more widely, around the mid-1800s, it got taken over to places like Australia, California. We see it in lots of other places now. So it is widely travelled, and it's also been really popular for a lot of this time. It's just its popularity has waned in more recent years. And I mentioned earlier that the reputation suffered due to inferior grape varieties with similar names. So that combined with the inferior wines that people assumed were Riesling, which was wrong. And also combined more recently with the trend for oak-aged wines, you know, Chardonnay, looking at you there. All of these factors have sort of combined together to mean that a Riesling essentially just fell out of popularity. But it is one that, I mean, obviously has not fallen completely out of popularity, otherwise we wouldn't have all of you here this evening. And it is one that I think when you like it, you really like it. So it's one of these grape varieties that particularly once people have been into wine for a while, seem to all kind of move towards Riesling. It gets you one way or the other in the end. Just a couple of questions there. The presentations will be included in the recording, yes. I would not say Riesling is a hybrid grape variety. No, a hybrid is when we're talking about two different species of vinifera. So Riesling is just a naturally occurring crossing instead, because all of the parents are from Vitis vinifera vines. Do keep your questions coming. Happy to answer them as I go along. So next, just wanted to touch a little bit on the wine styles that we can get from Riesling. So I've put dry or medium or sweet, but really it could be anything. We can get some that are off dry, some that are super luscious, and some that are just a bit sweet. And really anything in between. So for dry styles, there's a few regions around the world which have their reputation for drier styles. We'll touch on Alsace in a moment in particular. Often here, well, as I've said already, we get that high acidity, quite pronounced intensity, and the aromas that can range from fruits and floral, maybe honeyed notes, those are mineral characteristics. Medium wines, so here we're talking about wines that will have more sugar in them, still with that high acidity. Often these more medium styles associated with Germany. Places like the Moselle, for example, have quite a reputation for these medium sweet styles where the acidity actually helps balance with the sugar there. In terms of sweeter wines, we've got a few different ways that we can make sweeter Rieslings. So we've mentioned already that it's a grape variety that can withstand late harvesting, so building up sugar as the grapes get riper and the development of flavour that comes associated with that. We've got sweet wines that can be made from noble rot affected grapes. So noble rot we'll find not everywhere, not every year, but if we do have grapes that are affected by noble rot, it means that essentially the water evaporates and we get these really kind of shriveled, slightly mouldy, but concentrated grapes, which give us a very small amount of very concentrated juice to make a very sweet wine. Often when we're thinking about sweet wines made from noble rot affected grapes, we'll also get some particular aroma flavour characteristics such as marmalade, rye bread, dried apricot are often associated with noble rot affected sweet wines. But then, of course, there are other ways of making sweet wines from Riesling. Ice wine or ice wine, wine made from frozen grapes, is another potential way that we can make sweet wines from Riesling. And this is a very different way of thinking about sweet wines compared to the noble rot. Here we are looking at healthy grapes, no noble rot, no botrytis influence, left on the vines until they freeze, so until winter. And here we have to have grapes harvested overnight, essentially, when it's really cold, so that the ice, the water that's frozen inside the grapes doesn't melt, because otherwise it would all be lost. So it's another way of making sweet wines. So you've got all of these different styles of sweet wines. And then, of course, sparkling wine production. So Riesling can also make lovely sparkling wines. Typically, we'd be thinking about tank method sparkling as an aromatic grape variety. It's most often considered that tank method is best so that we can really just promote those aromatic characteristics of the grape variety. That said, you can certainly find some examples of traditional method sparkling wine from Riesling as well, where we would have that more yeasty autolytic character come through too. So a bit of everything. Sparklings can be dry or they can have some sugar in them. So again, using that versatility there. Just trying to catch up on a few questions. I said I'd answer all of them and then loads came in and I couldn't read them all. So question about Riesling's parents. Basically, it's not a clear lineage. So at some point, Traminer was involved. At some point, Gouet Blanc was involved, but there are other vines, other wild vines that would have been involved. So it's not essentially a clear lineage that we have for Riesling. Style of Washington Riesling, I'll mention that a bit later on. If there's some mold on your cork, but it smells fine, that should be fine. Even if a wine is out of condition, it's not going to do you any harm. So if it smells okay, then go for it. If you're not sure, maybe leave it. Regarding the styles, the amount of sugar is defined. So it depends which styles we're talking about. In many countries, they do have legal minimum requirements for the amount of sugar that needs to be in the grape. Not normally how much is in the wine. That would be down to the winemaker. Has the Riesling reputation compromised, especially in the UK? Yeah, over the last couple of decades, it's definitely fallen out of favour. Feel free to add in how it's going in your local market. Do people aim to make botrytis Riesling? Yeah, for sure, but it's not anything you can guarantee. So you might have areas where botrytis is more likely, or areas in your vineyard where botrytis is more likely. We know that botrytis likes to grow in humid conditions, so often we'll find that it's vineyards near to a body of water, a lake or a river where it's more likely to happen, but it's not anything that's guaranteed. So when you are enjoying your noble rot affected wines, do just reflect on that. Not only is it not guaranteed to happen every year, but when it does happen and you do get that lovely botrytis, you have to be, it's a very labour intensive job. Grapes for noble rot affected grapes are often picked individually by grape, not even by cutting off whole bunches. So that means you'll have to go through your vineyard several times as more grapes become ripe and just keep harvesting them selectively. So labour of love. Question: in a tasting lineup, what order do you suggest? An extensive amount of Rieslings and or a lineup of variety of other whites? I mean, personally, I'd be happy with a lineup of Rieslings. It would just depend on what you're aiming to achieve with that one, I think, whether you want to really deep dive in Riesling or you want to understand Riesling rather to other grape varieties. That's a long question, Samantha. Let me just read it. In the WSET textbook, the 6 predicate categories listed in ascending order within cabinet. So on. The ice wine is more of an event. Freezing can happen to grapes, which may have been heading for another classification. No, not really true that. So when we're making ice wine, your grapes have to be ripe but not affected by noble rot or anything else. So essentially, it's kind of a risk because you're leaving some of your grapes which are healthy on the vine, hoping that you'll get the right conditions for the freezing to occur. But it might not happen every year. Like with the noble rot, it's not guaranteed. So you could just be risking losing your grapes eventually. Okay, that was a question break. I'm gonna move on from now, otherwise I'm not sure I'll reach the end of the presentation. If I miss any of your questions, you can feel free to email me afterwards. A little bit on winemaking techniques. So Riesling is a grape variety. There are a few things that are common in production of particularly high quality Rieslings, which will be different to wines like Chardonnay, for example, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago. So I've listed a few of them here. It's not an exhaustive list, and as always, it's going to be down to each winemaker to decide which of these methods they will or will not do. So the first thing I've mentioned here is whole bunch pressing. So rather than de-stemming the grapes, they go into the presses whole, and this just means we can make sure we extract the most delicate juice that hasn't come into contact with any of the stems or anything that we don't want to. A different perspective to that is to do some skin contact. So when we talk about skin contact for white wines, it means leaving the skins and juice together, normally at a cool temperature before fermentation. So aromatic grape varieties like Riesling and other grape varieties, this can be true of as well, often have a layer of cells underneath the skin which has more aromas in it that it can impart to the juice. So by leaving the skins and juice for a short amount of time before fermentation, this can then add to the intensity, add to the characteristics of the wine. Some producers, we may even see leaving the skins in contact for a more extended amount of time. You can find orange wines now made with Riesling as well. So there's another style that I hadn't mentioned so far. There we go. In terms of fermentation, fermentation temperatures will be cool. That will help keep more of the aromatic, perfumed characteristics of the grape variety in play. Choices of vessel, yes, but ideally inert vessels. So stainless steel is inert, we know that, that's not going to react with the wine. But in many places it's traditional to use old oak. So oak we often talk about as having this ability to impart characteristics to the wine, but oak that's been used enough times will have lost its flavour. So some producers in Alsace, for example, will have big, like massive old oak vessels that are decades old, maybe over a century old, and they are not going to impart anything in terms of oaky flavours to the wine, but it's traditional to use those instead. In terms of other varieties, other winemaking techniques, MLF is generally inhibited. MLF, we're talking about malolactic fermentation. So this is practiced on some wines to soften acidity and can add creamy flavours. It can also mute varietal characteristics a little bit. So for Riesling, where we want to keep those varietal characters and we want to keep our high acidity, it's not really suited to the wine styles here. Typo there, it's meant to say lees contact, not less contact, apologies. Lees contact is possible, so leaving the lees, the dead yeast cells, in contact with the wine after fermentation will help add some texture, some body to the wine, and then again that will be an option for the winemaker. And typically we're looking at wines that are bottled young, so we want to make sure that we keep as much of that bright primary characteristic in the wine and then give it the potential to develop these tertiary characteristics, these bottle development characteristics later on. Oops. Okay, from here, just wanted to throw up the world map and have a little bit of a think about regions where we would find Riesling, because there's a lot of them. So we know when we're talking about the origin, we're talking about Germany, right up on this 50 latitude here. I mentioned France as well, Alsace in France, really far north. All around Europe, though, you'll find examples of Riesling. So Italy, lots of Eastern European countries, Croatia, Slovenia. Again, it traveled a lot around countries around here, so you find it there. A little bit in Spain, not so much, most of it a bit warm for Riesling. We'll find it in America, of course, in California. There's quite a lot of Riesling planted, but we'll also see it in New York, Canada too, cooler parts of Chile and Argentina, particularly further south again, we'll find it. Similarly, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, all of the main countries that you can think of are producing different producing styles of Riesling. So it is widely travelled. When we're thinking about some of these sort of New World countries, we're going to have to be thinking about the places that are slightly more moderated, slightly cooler, because as I've said, it's not going to grow, it's not well suited to anywhere that's too warm. If it ripens too quickly, you just don't get that build-up of flavour, you don't get that aromatic intensity or complexity. So finding somewhere where the temperature is moderated, perhaps by proximity to the coast or altitude, then that's where we can see the best examples made. So from here, I'm going to just touch on a few important regions for Riesling. By no means all of them, but just to give you an idea of some of the history and some of the different styles. So we will of course have to talk about Germany. So you can see the different regions of Germany here. You might also be able to notice we've got the 50 latitude just here in Germany too. So if we consider that 50 degrees is normally our northern limit of grape growing, we've got quite a few German regions that are straddling that. So it is very much a cool climate. Riesling obviously grows really well here, but particularly in those northern parts, we've got to think about making sure that Riesling is planted on the best sites where we've got that south-facing aspect to get more exposure to the sunshine. Often darker soils or stony soils, or vineyards overlooking a river where we can benefit from reflected light. So site selection is quite important. And Riesling, of course, gets the best sites in most regions anyway. So a few comments on the history of Riesling in Germany. Well, the half of the world's Riesling produced in Germany is not historical, that's still quite recent. We mentioned earlier that evidence exists for Riesling from the 1400s, so it was around for a long time and it was recognised as a quality variety. And by the time we get to the 18th century, the planting of Riesling was actively encouraged. It was recognised that this grape variety produces some really high quality wines, so we should plant more of it. It makes sense. One of the things that may not have shown Riesling to its best potential around this time, though, was that the grapes will have been picked often a bit too early. So given what we've said about Riesling ripening later, it's often where in these later stages where we can get more of these aromas and flavours. So by picking it too early, we can make a nice wine for sure, but it just won't have that intensity or some of those typical perfumed Riesling characteristics that is often what we look for. But people kept planting it, the plantings kept growing, so that was good. By the time we get to the 19th and into the end of the 19th into the 20th century, Rieslings from Germany are some of the most highly prized wines in the world. You know, if you were throwing a fancy dinner party, you would be getting, your white wine would be a German Riesling and your red wine would be from Bordeaux or Burgundy. You know, it was thought of in that kind of same level of quality. Yeah, Riesling, especially German Riesling, was very highly regarded. And then we come into a couple of these problems that I've mentioned already. In the 1930s was where particularly the German wine trade had been suffering for a number of decades from phylloxera, from grey rot, from the economic implications of the war. There just wasn't enough going to make enough people buying German wines to make sure that the trade could survive. So it was recommended that producers focus on their marketing, on creating brands that would be recognizable among international consumers. So one of the ones that you will recognize in the UK probably is Liebfraumilch. And this was one of these brands that was created, and it was actually aimed at the UK market. Yeah, I know, I've spelled it wrong again, never mind. And so, yeah, it was made from a blend of grapes, it was made from a blend of regions, and it was sweetened with sugar added after fermentation. So if you've done much studying with your WSET qualifications, you'll know that this is not the recipe to make the highest quality wine. And it certainly was not the highest quality wine. So it was accessible, it was easy to drink, it was recognizable, and it was inexpensive. So it became very popular. However, it kind of brought down the reputation of Germany by association. And then following on from that, we can see later on an increase in plantings of other grape varieties. So Riesling was highly prized, but as we've said, it had all the best sites, and it's a late ripener. So particularly in Germany, where we have a cool climate, we might not be guaranteed to get the conditions we need every year to allow Riesling to reach its later stages of ripeness. So it was seen that it was easier to plant some of the crossings, grape varieties that had been created that were easier to ripen, that produced wines that were still palatable, but just didn't necessarily have that intensity or concentration that we expect from Riesling. But for the grape grower, it was a bit easier and they could still make their money from it. So those varieties increased, and then Riesling by necessity had to decrease. So we went from the majority of most regions being particularly favoured towards Riesling to actually that decreased by a significant amount over following decades. It's stabilised a bit now. New young grape growers, winemakers are recognising that Riesling is the grape variety that should be prioritised, which is where we come to generation Riesling. So this is indicating winemakers that exist now, whose priority is to create and promote quite high quality Rieslings and move away from these easier ripening Rieslings, easier ripening crossings that were more of a trend for a while. Catching up on some of your questions. Was Trocken popular in 18th and 19th centuries? Yeah, many of the wines will have been dry. The sweetness has always been varied. In fact, that actually leads me nicely to Riesling and the Predikatswein system. So, talked about the different levels of sweetness that we can get for Rieslings. And if you've spent any time studying German wine, then you'll know that we've got this selection of labelling terms referred to as the Predikatswein system. So this has come about as a way to recognise essentially the different styles of wine according to the different times of harvest of the grapes. So this was created by Schloss Johannisberg in Rheingau, one of the more famous German estates. Apparently the reason that Riesling in California used to be referred to as Johannisberg Riesling all down to this particular producer, so quite famous. And it was growers here who recognised that Riesling was able to develop flavours, aromas later on its ripening stage. So we've got here in 1775 the first use of the term spätlese. So spätlese literally translated means late picked. So when they realised that if you harvested the grapes later, they build up more flavours, but they also related it back to the amount of sugar in the grapes. So spätlese, we're thinking about grapes that are riper, have more sugar, but it doesn't mean that it makes a sweeter wine necessarily. Where we start with a certain amount of sugar, we can either ferment that all to dry, we can have a dry wine, or we can retain some of the sugar and have an off-dry wine. So spätlese tends to be sort of between dry, often up to medium-ish levels of sweetness. It was also Schloss Johannesburg, which are recognised with noticing noble rot growth on Riesling. So 1776 was where it was first noticed that these mouldy looking grapes that were affected by noble rot actually made really good tasting wine. So from there we see some of the other categories of the Predicatswein system evolved, the Alsace, Beeren Auslese and Trockenbeeren Auslese. So one of the key factors here, which marks out this classification as different to what we'll see in the appellation of France, for example, is that the focus is on the must weight rather than the yield. So the focus is on the amount of sugar in the grapes rather than the yield, how many grapes were grown per vine. And that's what's going to distinguish the grapes into the different categories. So yields has never been a massive thing in Germany. There are, of course, legal limitations in place, but that's more of a modern creation. Historically, it was not necessarily as important to have particularly low yields, but what you wanted to focus on was ripeness. And again, coming back to Germany, being a cool climate where we're not guaranteed to get the exact conditions we need every year for ripe grapes, it makes sense that this is the way to recognise particularly high quality wines. If you've got those natural conditions that allow you to leave the grapes on the vine for longer to build up this level of ripeness, then that's where we're going to get our higher quality wines from. And then the other categories sort of followed years later. So 1971 is where Cabinet was defined, along with a whole load of changes to German wine law. And more recently, 1982 was when ice wine became a separate category. So, moving on from Germany then, I wanted to mention Alsace as well, just because I really like Alsace, particularly Alsace Riesling. So Alsace, as you can see from the map, really close to Germany. Historically was part of Germany. It's kind of gone back and forth a little bit between the two countries. So now it is part of France, but has a very Germanic influence in terms of wines in particular. So Riesling is the most widely planted grape variety in Alsace, whereas you don't find it in any other region in France. We also find differences in terms of the labelling in Alsace compared to other regions. We don't have the same complicated appellation system we will see in Burgundy or Bordeaux. And we do have varietal labelling, very common in Alsace as well. Single varietal wines, often with the grape variety indicated on the label. So labelling here much more similar, not the same, as what you'd expect in Germany. So it is a bit of a unique example in terms of French wine labelling. And in terms of why it's so suited to these aromatic varieties, it's all to do with the natural conditions here. So you can see we've got the Vosges Mountains, small in the map on the left, much larger in the map on the right. So the Vosges Mountains have this effect of essentially creating a rain shadow for the vineyards of Alsace. All the wind and the rain that comes across the body of France is stopped by the mountains. So where the vineyards are, on the eastern side of these mountains, they are dry, they are sunny. We've got some of the driest vineyards in France right here, purely by virtue of being on the other side of the Vosges Mountains. And again, like I've said a few times already, Riesling is a variety that likes that long, dry growing season. Here it can just, again, be left to build up more sugar, more intensity, more flavour, where we've got this long ripening period that can stretch into autumn. Little bit of a lovely picture of Alsace there. So like with Germany, even though we get this long extended ripening season, we still need good sites to ripen Riesling on. So again, due to that, the Vosges Mountains, we'll find that the vineyards are often planted on the lower slopes. So you're getting that favourable aspect, southeast facing, which means that we can get enough sun exposure, enough heat exposure for Riesling to ripen. Compared to German styles, typically we expect Alsatian Riesling to be drier, but again can develop those floral mineral notes and also can age extremely well. Now this is the point where I look at my glass of Alsace Riesling and think, I've not actually tasted anything from this for a while, so but I'll just talk a little bit about the wine that I've opened to taste along with this session today. So I did go for an Alsace Riesling. I've got an Alsace Grand Cru Riesling, in fact, from 2013, which explains why, I mean, you might be able to see through the camera there that it's actually got this slightly more golden tone to it. We know with white wines that as they age, they can get a little bit more intensity and move towards these more golden colours, and that's starting to happen here. Pronounced intensity, it's got this slightly dried fruit aroma coming through, like dried apple, dried peaches, got some honey, definitely still got that kind of floral note, and some really kind of ripe citrus as well, sort of citrus zest. Something a little bit kind of wet stones or flinty about it. We don't like really describing wines as mineral so much, so I'll say flinty. And it hasn't got any of those kind of petrol or kerosene characteristics that I talked about earlier. I know they sound like they would put people off, but a lot of people actually really quite like them. But it's just not there in this particular example. Yeah, I mean, that's just awesome. Very dry, very high acidity. A lot of mouth-watering right now. Probably shouldn't have tasted that while I'm still trying to speak. But loads of flavour. Lovely texture to it as well. Not full-bodied, but certainly at the higher end of medium. And just all those flavours kind of lingering on the finish. Quite a long finish there as well. So, so lots of nice complexity, nice structure. It was just lovely. So that was just me completely stopping in the middle of my slide to drink some wine. Apologies. The other terms that I've left at the bottom there are also labelling terms. So these apply to Alsace. So Vendange tardive is late harvest in French instead. So you can see there an equivalent with the Spätlese that we talked about in Germany. And the Sélection de Grand Noble is for noble rot affected sweet wines. So Vendange tardive again can vary in sweetness, can be dry, off dry, medium, whereas the Sélection de Grand Nobles has to be a sweet wine because we're looking at noble rot affected grapes. And then finally, Grand Cru, indicating a vineyard site in the region that has been defined as being suitable to use the term Grand Cru. I'm quite hesitant when I talk about this because it's not necessarily appropriate to say the better sites in Alsace or Grand Cru. It's actually quite a controversial system where some of the vineyards that have been assigned Grand Cru status maybe don't deserve it. Some of them are really quite big, cover quite a large area of different soils, different microclimates, where it's maybe not appropriate for it to be a single Grand Cru site. So because of that, some producers choose not to use the term Grand Cru. They don't necessarily agree with it. Or some producers will use wines that are maybe a bit inferior, but use the labelling term Grand Cru because they can. So be warned with Grand Cru. Not true of Burgundy. No, Burgundy is, well, mostly no. There's always going to be a bit of variation, but I think in Alsace, the vineyard sites are just generally much bigger. I can see your questions flying past me and I'm not having a chance to read some of them. Is the petrol note dependent on climate and or bottle age? Yes. And yeah, so it's something that we associate with more mature Rieslings. Often we'll find that in warmer climates, it's a note that develops earlier. So a Riesling from Australia, for example, won't necessarily have to be that old to show this petrol or kerosene characteristic. But you're also right in that some just don't develop them. Some producers will choose clones, choose versions of Riesling where it doesn't appear. So it's not guaranteed to happen on every Riesling. What wine was it? Oh, my wine is the Pierre Frick Grand Cru Vorberg from 2013, a biodynamic wine. Oh, I just really like it. Okay. Onwards then to Australia. So I wanted to pick Australia as an example of a more New World region to talk about, because Riesling's been there for actually a really long time. So it's the sort of 1850s that Riesling was first taken over to Australia. So it's not that new, essentially. And here, like in many other parts of the world, Riesling was a really important grape variety. It was the most important white grape variety for a long time. But then trends kind of changed. So when we're thinking about Riesling in Australia, as I mentioned earlier, we do have to think about the slightly more moderated climates, where it's not going to be too warm, where the grapes can still ripen slower. So here we're looking at bits of South Australia, but the higher altitude bits in South Australia. Where we get higher altitude, we have that greater diurnal range, cooler nights, which means that the grapes can develop more slowly. Parts of Tasmania, a bit in Victoria, yeah, a few different places where we can find Riesling in Australia, but we've always got to be thinking about somewhere that is more moderate. It's not going to do as successfully in the same places that Shiraz grows, for the most part. So here we go, first documented in 1837, and it was popular with the Silesian settlers at the time. So Silesia was basically where bits of Germany and Poland and Czech Republic are now. So very much overlaps with those regions that we think of as making a lot of Riesling. So popular in terms of drinking, but also popular in terms of growing. So it was very widely planted, particularly in South Australia. And it was Australia's leading white variety by the 1960s, to the extent that if someone asked for a dry white wine, they were just talking about a Riesling. You didn't even have to name the grape variety. If you're talking about a dry white wine, then you're talking about a Riesling. Which again goes to show that the style here was very much towards the drier wines. Before this, a lot of the wines being produced in Australia were often sweet and fortified. So going from that high alcohol, high sugar to this dry, high acid style, you can see how that became really popular, why that was a nice contrast for people. But again, didn't really last. There was some confusion over labelling. Wines that were labelled Riesling might be labelled as sweet when they were not, or other varieties that had some sugar, the other wines that had sugar in were labelled Riesling when it was in fact a different variety. So it did fall apart a little bit. And then, as you will all know, Chardonnay became the more fashionable grape variety. So plantings of Riesling quickly reduced and Chardonnay became more popular. But again, like in other places, Riesling has remained popular for many grape growers, winemakers, and it's coming back. It's making its way back, especially as trends for Chardonnay have abated somewhat in more recent years. Okay, so getting near the end. Riesling and food was something that I wanted to mention. Riesling, I think it's often one of the most food-friendly grape varieties, and that goes for any style of Riesling that you want to look at. So drier styles go, you know, just as it's 6 o'clock in the evening and I want to have a glass of Riesling, fine. Having them with, you know, your typical fish dishes or white meat dishes, perfect. Medium styles often go well with spicy foods. So if you've, I don't know, it depends on what you eat. If you're into your curries or more kind of Mexican foods or various things where you can find spices, Riesling, medium sweet Riesling is top notch. The sweetness in the wine will offset the spiciness. So whereas with a dry wine, it makes your food taste spicier and then your wine taste basically less fruity. Medium styles can actually offset that. So the wine tastes good, food tastes good, all good. And then for sweet styles, so sweet wines we normally associate with dessert, but that's not exclusively how you can enjoy them. I very much recommend having your sweet wines with blue cheese. Sweet and salty contrast works really well. Or pâté is a classic match for sweet wines too. And then aged styles. So as the wines develop and they build up more of these flavors, they actually work well with really kind of concentrated, rich styles of food as well. So whereas your more youthful styles, as we said, maybe more for aperitif or lighter dishes, if you've got something that's kind of richly flavored, really concentrated, then pairing it with something aged works really well. It's a wine that can stand up to a lot of different types of food, so don't be scared to match it with different things. I must finish before I start drinking my wine. So here we come to the end of the presentation and kind of call to arms here. Riesling is still a misunderstood grape variety, still has people who would assume they don't like it before even trying it. So if you do get the chance to share some with your friends or with your family, just get out there, spread the word. You may have heard of the 31 Days of Riesling campaign. It runs every year. Normally kind of promoted by restaurants and retailers. I'm not sure what the plan is this year, but if you want an excuse to go and get more Riesling, it will be provided for you. So keep your eyes open in July for opportunities for more Riesling. And that does bring us to the end of all the information. So feel free to hang around if you've got some questions. I shall end the recording now.